My husband said, if I can't find Barbara, all I have to do is listen, because she whistles her S's. Well, that changed when I had some tooth work. You can no longer hear me whistle my S's the way you used to. But I said to him, no problem. Now you just look around for a little woman who looks like a Q-tip. You've noticed the change, right? There comes a point at which you say, why not? Right? And so here I am, why not? So for those of you who are far in the back, I actually do encourage you to come forward. And the reason for that is, A, we've got space in the front of the row. And B, as I tell my students, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to succeed in that here, but I tell my students, if nobody sits in the front row, then I'll remove the front row of chairs. Right, so it's just, how do we get companionable? All right. I will. All righty. We're good. Oh my God. So this means I can't walk around and move. No, we're good, John. I will try to restrain myself. And whew. All right, so books and covers. People, I have to tell you, when Rutledge gave me this cover for Male Friendship, Homosociality, and Women in the Hebrew Bible, I said to my husband, well, that looks an awful lot like my grandmother's wallpaper, the Paisley wallpaper. And I think they did that because inside I'm going like that all the way through the whole thing, right? And outside it just looks so gentle. Not so much. Anyway, I brought it to show you, and if anybody is interested in purchasing a copy, you may see me after this talk. Yeah, but more importantly, we have 3 weeks. I don't know, am I getting started here? Am I official now? Okay, great, we're going. We're going because we're late. So I'm going to be talking especially fast. You just raise your hand and interrupt me if I get to be at the point where I'm not making any sense. So we have 3 weeks as usual. And you do not have to duck. It's fine. Stand tall. And we're going to be looking at David's women. And they are, in many respects, actually not the subject of this book, but the subject of my next book, which is coming out in May, called Rape Culture in the House of David, A Company of Men. And in that is a little mini monograph. It's a bit shorter than the usual kind. And in that book, I spend a lot of time talking about and writing about not just individual acts by individual male characters, but at the systemic concerns we find operating around what we call biblical hegemonic masculinity, which is a kind of newfangled word for what we used to call patriarchy. So this is what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks, just so you have kind of spoiler alerts. So today we're going to talk about Michal. And Michal is not the same kind of subject as next week and the following week. This next week and the following week will be dealing with the women of David's house who experience direct, unmitigated sexual violence that we cannot ignore. So we'll be talking about Bathsheba next week, and then the following week we'll be talking about Tamar, and we'll also be talking about David's Pilagshim, often translated as concubines, not, in my opinion, appropriately. I'll explain why when we get there. So next week, I will actually be opening by describing why it is that I think that the term rape culture actually works for biblical texts, because as a historian, normally my reaction to using modern terms for ancient texts is don't be doing that, right? Don't be doing that. But there is a reason that I do that, and next week I'll explain why. And this week, we'll be taking a look at the story of Michal. So you have a handout with the relevant texts, and as usual, I give you the Hebrew because I know you care about that piece. But sometimes I say something about the Hebrew, and so I want you to be able to have it in front of you. And what we're going to do is start with Michal's backstory. Like, what is the backstory before she arrives on the scene? And after we do that, we'll take a look at 4 different episodes with Michal. She actually is only named 6 times in the Hebrew Bible, but an incredibly important character. So the backstory here really begins with the second version of David's arrival at court. There are 2 separate stories that have been combined in 1 Samuel. The second one is when he arrives during a battle in which Goliath is busily taunting and frightening the Israelites. And as you know that story, David steps forward where everyone else, including King Saul, is afraid, clearly, to do battle with Goliath. And of course, then the famous story of him using his slingshot to kill him, and the thing that's less remembered, taking his own sword, cutting off Goliath's head. There's actually a lot of interesting sexual imagery in the killing of Goliath. Ask me about it some other time, because we won't have time for that. But it is there. And David, in chapter 18, the chapter that follows, then accomplishes one conquest after another. Do any of you ever listen to Stephen Sondheim's work? All right, one person in there, two people in this room. So somebody might remember in Sunday in the Park with George, there's a song called Everybody Loves Louie, right? You know, everybody loves Louie. And then the singer just goes on and on about that. Well, everybody loves David. Everybody falls in love with David. David is never said to love anybody, but everybody loves David. So in chapter 18, what we learn is how everybody learns to love David. For saving Israel from Goliath, for enacting the very thing that the king is supposed to do. David actively almost impersonates Saul by going out at the head of Saul's troops and battling the Philistines. And the troops love him. The courtiers love him. Jonathan loves him. Everybody loves him. And after earning the love of basically all the men of Israel, even Saul, who also is said to love him, he earns the love of all the women in Israel. This is actually a key point. He comes back from war, and the women go out into the streets. I don't know if that was symbolic that the people started falling off. The women go out into the streets, and what do? They dance and they sing, ostensibly for Saul, but the man who's coming back at the head of the troops ain't Saul. It's David. And so you'll see at the very beginning here of that handout that I gave to you that the women are described singing and dancing to greet King Saul, but the one that they praise is not Saul but David. Saul has killed his thousands in 18:7, but David his tens of thousands. The person who's really getting the attention is David. And these are the women of all the towns of Israel. So they are meant to represent all the women of Israel. So David has apparently not only had conquests with all the men of Israel, it's now all the women of Israel. Everybody loves David. Everybody loves David. So what do we learn from this backstory? We learn that David knows how to impersonate the king. It is the king's job, according to 1 Samuel 8, to be at the head of his troops. We have already learned that David has won the love of the entire court and all the troops, and now he has all the women of Israel. And it is this backdrop, this important backdrop, that will be the piece that will introduce us to Michal. What should we notice about this section and about this backdrop? The word that's used for dancing here, chol, is a word that is associated with fertility. It is a word that is associated with sexuality. You will find it in Isaiah twice. You'll find it in Jeremiah. It'll be associated there with turning and writhing while giving birth. It is also associated with dancing in ways that lead to interesting sexual encounters. The women of Shiloh are dancing in a festival to the deity, to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, or the Israelite deity. And you might have heard his name as Yahweh, but you'll hear me refer to that deity as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, which are the Hebrew words, the Hebrew letters for his name. And they also are dancing when the Benjaminites come in and capture them and take them in a kind of mass, I will be honest here, a mass act of rape. They're taking these completely helpless women who have been given away effectively without their knowing by their fathers to the Benjaminites. So the word hol that is used to describe these women dancing is sexually charged. So effectively, David has acquired all the bodies of the women of Israel for his viewing pleasure. That's effectively the scene here. Women are turning, they are writhing, they are dancing, they are praising him. He is the virile hero of the hour, and Saul is the mortified and, in effect, emasculated king. Next year, when I come back, I may want to spend all 3 sessions on Saul, who I am writing a paper for SBL, the Society for Biblical Literature, this fall, and I'm describing him as a trauma victim. That ought to be fun. So, Saul's reaction is that David is a threat, and he sees his daughters as bait, and we have a verse 18:8, which I didn't have on your page, where he says, to David they've given tens of thousands, to me they've given thousands, all that he lacks is the kingship. Right? Saul immediately identifies that David has everything but the crown on his head at this point. Right? And from that day on, as the biblical writer tells us, we know that Saul will keep a jealous eye on David. That's when we meet Michal. Instantly, we learn that Michal's desires, her own desires, or even access to her body, none of this can be separated from male agendas. She is encircled by male agendas in the very moment that we meet her. We meet her in 1 Samuel 18:20, also on your page. Michal, daughter of Saul, had fallen in love with David, and when this was reported to Saul, he was pleased. Take this verse apart, and you find a number of things are going on. One simple verse, it has a lot to say. Firstly, Michal is the only woman in the Hebrew Bible ever said to love a man. Ever. Hold that thought. There's no other woman in the Hebrew Bible who is said to love a man. Second, the author is not actually interested in her love for her sake. It's not about Michal. It is instantly about how that love can be leveraged. That's why she is the only woman said to love a man, because her love is immediately a tool. It is immediately usable. The courtiers know this, and if you look closely at the story of Saul and David, you will find courtiers playing an incredibly important role. How they travel, how they move gossip around, how they take messages, how they triangulate. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. So the author isn't actually interested in her love for her sake. He's interested in it in the way that it can be leveraged. And how can it be leveraged? The courtmen get some juicy gossip. Oh, Michal loves David. Isn't that interesting? You can hear them whispering in the corridors, and you can hear them knowing really, really well, instinctively, that that kind of juicy gossip should be taken straight to the king. And they do. They take it straight to the king. And in so doing, how is Saul reacting? Well, his reaction, this is great, because he's already been thinking about passing his eldest daughter, Merab, to David in a way that will manipulate David into taking on military roles that will endanger him immediately, right? Make David fight the Philistines again and again and again, and he's toast eventually, or even sooner than eventually, because the Philistines are a formidable adversary. Remember that in this world, the only people with swords that we know of, right, who have spears and swords, are Saul and Jonathan, right? The Philistines are the ones who have much more in the way of military technology, right? There's even a complaint about the fact that the Israelites don't have the weaponry to fight the Philistines the way the Philistines have the weaponry to fight the Israelites. So, you know, there's a pretty dangerous thing that you are facing here. And I misspoke. I should have said spear, not sword. However, the Philistines really and truly are absolutely in command of the military means. They're the ones with the chariots. They're the ones with the overwhelming means to slaughter the Israelites, and they do pretty regularly. However, David manages, as we see, to fight back. So, for the king, he ends up not giving Merab to David. And my own speculation about this is because that's a little bit too close to have the eldest daughter married off to David. That's a little too close to the throne, even though there's Jonathan in the wings. Saul has already witnessed Jonathan practically abdicating already his role by giving David his own clothing, his own sword. He hands it over to David. So Saul has reason to be nervous about his children and the extent to which they might support David against him. So he finds out Michal is in love, and he has a great way to bait David. You go, you defeat the Philistines, and what's more, I want you to bring back 100 foreskins from the Philistine dead. Prove to me your vigor and your virility, and you can have the second one. That's how he refers to Michal. The second one can still be yours. Right? And David, who has never lacked for confidence, and for apparently good reason, goes out and comes back with 200 Philistine foreskins, which he then lays at Saul's feet. In front of the entire court, can you imagine the humiliation for the king? This is one-upmanship on a grand scale, and it's public, and it's in front of all of the king's men. And Michal is then purchased through an act of sexual violence against the corpses of the enemy, right? So just think about the imagery and let it sit with you. What happens? Michal is his. Saul is once again facing that David is an imminent and obvious threat to him. And so he starts in a frantic way trying to figure out how to trap David and even to execute him. This is already after he's asked Jonathan and his courtiers to do away with David. So he orders some of his courtiers down to David's house, or up, I don't know, doesn't give us the direction, but over to David's house. And David is supposed to be in house arrest at night, and he's supposed to be killed in the morning when he comes out of the house. Now, it has often been the case that scholars and exegetes have looked at what Michal does next and praised her loyalty and her love for David and her cleverness. Do you know the story? Right? She does all sorts of delaying tactics. She says, no, David's sick. He can't come to Saul. He can't do this. He can't do that. She helps him escape through a window. Remember this? Anybody remember this story? She dresses up a doll as if it's David, puts it in the bed, right, so that they think David's sleeping. She does all sorts of stuff. And people have looked at this and said, wow, clearly her love for David, amazing, right? And clearly, how clever is she? But I want you to look at this from another perspective, and that is hers. That is her perspective. She later threatens to her father when he says, why did you do this? You betrayed me. She says, David said he would kill me if I didn't help him. Do we ever know whether she's lying? We don't. We don't know. Is it possible? Maybe. We don't know. So I just want to put that little doubt into our heads. Is David capable of all sorts of manipulation in order to get what he wants? When we get to Bathsheba, we'll see that kind of manipulation on a grand scale. Yes, he is. He absolutely is. Secondly, she is trapped with David in that house. Now keep in mind, you are trapped in a house with the best warrior in all Israel, who's a consummate killer. David kills more human beings than you can imagine. David Klein, the famous biblical scholar, has counted this up and says, look at the tens of thousands of people, and not just enemies, but men, women, and children, right, of enemy towns David will slaughter in his life. So she's got a consummate killer in the house. She can fully expect that when those courtiers come to try to kill David, there's going to be a bloodbath. And please remember that in Hebrew Bible, when men come to a house to kill or abuse men, think Lot, Genesis 19, think Judges 19 and the Levite's concubine. Women in the house are frequently bartered or offered to the men outside. Remember? Right? What happens to women trapped in a house with men who are in a state of conflict with other men. Walls don't protect women in the Hebrew Bible. Their safety is entirely dependent on the men who live either outside or inside the house. Michal then is caught in a life or death contest between these men outside and her husband inside. Saul's messengers are planning to kill, as I said, the fiercest of warriors, and a bloody encounter is inevitable. So getting him out of the house may be an act of self-preservation too. Something we don't think of, right? Does she save her own life by doing it? She has to answer to David's needs. She has to navigate the danger posed by Saul's executioners by fooling them and buying time. And then she has to deal with a father who suffers from an evil spirit sent by God. So periods of madness, you might remember, that ruach ra'ah, that God injects into Saul as part of God's plan to get David on the throne, right? There's a lot of sneaky stuff going on. Ask me about the third book that I'm getting into because it's going to be dealing with that. So, what do we know by now? Michal has been given by her father, taken by David, isolated and left behind by both, right? The men of the court are the witnesses and collaborators. David makes no effort to return for her. Her father is going to send her off to be taken by yet another man, Paltiel. Michal effectively all but disappears at this point, and in the meantime, David busily goes around getting more women, just finding more women. So it's Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, who he takes from another man. David is really expert at taking women from other men, right? And then we're going to get 6 wives, by which he has 6 children, 6 sons, and then an additional set of wives and concubines that he takes when he conquers Jerusalem. It's a lot of folks, So where are we now? Michal forgotten, David has acquired a harem. And the next time she shows up, she is once again going to be encircled by male agendas. It's going to happen all over again. She's married to Paltiel, seemingly happily. We don't know. We do know how Paltiel feels about her, because when she is taken from him, he follows after her crying, weeping. So what happens in this third episode? This is all about David's politics. He has basically pretty much wiped the house of Saul off the map, except for Ishbosheth, one of Saul's last surviving sons. And Abner, Saul's once upon a time right-hand man, makes that son the king of northern Israel. So what has David got? This one Saul's son, king, pretender to the throne. That's the one man that has to be done away with. That's the one vestige of the house that he has to take care of. Unbeknownst to him, Abner is having his own kind of conflict with the man he has just made king. Abner takes Saul's concubine Rizpah. Anybody remember this scene? He takes one of the former king's women for himself. What does that mean? Yeah, you're nodding your head. It's kind of up to the king, isn't it? To the son. Because he's the one who should be in control, at least, of this woman and her body. And Abner has basically demonstrated you don't have control. You don't have control of the women of your own house and the women that are remaining from Saul's own harem. The text says that Abner is making himself strong. The word that's used here, mitchazek, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 6. I hope I put that on there. I might not have put that particular verse up there. But in any case, the word that is used in that is a word that is operative and used repeatedly for to seize. To seize. And why is that important? Repeatedly it comes up in places where women are seized and raped. Tamar, for example, of 2 Samuel 13, is seized by Amnon and raped. So that Abner, mitchazek, is making him strong, is seizing things, has a sexual connotation, or at least in a sexual association. What happens, right? This is operative all the time in texts where men take women, We see this in Judges 5:32, where Sisera's mother describes Sisera. He's going to come home having seized 2 women for every soldier. And the language here, people, is crude and upsetting. Because the language in the Hebrew says he's going to take 2 wombs. 2 wombs for every man. Effectively, you will pardon my using, or at least referring to a word. Imagine the worst word you could call a woman. Effectively, in Hebrew, that's what's being said here. They're only being taken in that imagination for the sexual access these men will have to. So, he takes Rizpah, and when Saul's son, Ishbosheth, protests, Abner gets really angry, and what does he do? He says, I've had enough of you, I'm switching sides. He's going over to David. So he connects with David and says, dude, guess what? And David, never a man to lose the slightest opportunity to gain yet more power, says, all right, you can join my forces on one condition. You're going to prove your loyalty. Anybody remember what he asks for? Michal. Right. He asks for Michal. He says, you won't come in front of me until you bring Michal with you. And then I'll know you're on my side. Why? Because Michal is Saul's daughter. Michal was his first wife. Michal can connect him and make him look like he really is the correct descendant, and having the throne with Michal at his side is visually, it's a propaganda move, I'm telling you. It's great. Michal is his trophy wife, in a way, right? And so, in fact, Michal is taken from the only man in this whole narrative who might actually have cared for her. Right? Again, Paltiel follows her weeping when she is taken from him. We don't know how Michal felt about it, but it's significant, right? The only man that might really have cared for her follows after her. To no avail. So what happens? I'd like to go through this 4th piece slowly because I want to have time for questions and comments and conversation with you. But I want to get it right. Michal has been encircled now, we've seen, 3 times. First, by the courtiers and her father in the marriage to David. Second, by the courtiers and David herself and her father in this whole attack on David's life. Third, in this situation with Abner. Not at any point has Michal really been free to act for herself. And that's important for us to note. In this 4th episode, she is once again trapped, and she is once again forgotten, but this time forever. And in a way that is so cruel that it is really difficult to look at the closing verses on what happens to Michal without feeling this is a story of a woman who got caught up in David's ambition, who got caught up in male competitions, and whose entire life was really controlled in ways that are absolutely devastating for us to see. So at this point, David has taken care of all of his conquests. Jerusalem is his, along with a number of women in it. And he is going to bring the ark to Jerusalem. You know, I've always found this one scene hilariously funny, and I'm going to tell it here. It happened at another church. My son and our son and I went to a church in Concord that was experiencing some violent protests around the baptizing of LGBTQ human beings. And we went and walked through the protesters with our kippot on and our talitot for a Sunday morning service as a demonstration. We sat down for the service, and at one point the children's choir began singing a song, and David danced. And my son kind of went, Mom, do those kids know what they're singing about? And I said, what mothers do in those situations, which is, shh. So what happens, right? David brings the ark to Jerusalem. We all know, even in the English translation, and the Hebrew is pretty interesting. He is wearing a linen ephod. What is that ephod? It's kind of an apron, and it ends up, frankly, being placed right before your genitals, right? And that seems in the text to be about all that David is wearing. So naked except for this, thing in front of his genitals, and we all know what happens. He whirls, he dances, he is ecstatic. It is an exhibitionist frenzy. He is turning and writhing, right? Leaping and dancing. And he exposes himself in front of all the troops and all the women. All of Israel gets to see the king. This is a new take on the emperor has no clothes, And the passage is actually awash with sexual imagery your translations will not give you because, among other things, there are sexual associations associated with the stuff that he's dancing in front of. God stuff. That's next year maybe, right? We'll go through all of the phallic symbols that David is dancing in front of that represent the deity's sexualized energies. I know this is a little bit shocking because probably what happened the hour before this would not really seem commensurate with what I am doing here. So I understand. So we have a kind of image that reminded me when I was thinking about this. I just remember, because I'm kind of a prude even though I do this work, remembering a video of my youth when Michael Jackson was dancing and then he grabbed his own crotch. And I just remember going, ick. Apparently, because I've stopped watching any kind of cultural stuff produced in this country for years, that is now de rigueur and people do all sorts of things in these videos. But if you imagine this kind of experience, that's probably what we're looking at. And Michal sees this from a window. Already a significant thing, how often somebody is looking from a window and seeing something sexual happen out there, right? Avimelech, chapter 26 of Genesis, looks out the window and Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac is playing with Rebekah, sporting with Rebekah. Isaac is effectively exposing his wife to his own kind of exhibitionist moment. Nobody knows whether Rebekah is game for this, right? But Avimelech and all the men with him at whatever monumental palatial place he lives in, he is a king, get to observe, right? So we get to see things going on repeatedly in Hebrew Bible. What do you get to see when you look out a window? And Michal looks out a window and sees what David is doing, and she is appalled. She challenges him, as you'll see on your texts, right? That's on page 2. She says, she sees him at this very top, 2 Samuel 6:16. She looks out, she sees him leaping and whirling, and she despises him for it. And on a later verse, when he finally gets home, she walks out to meet him, and she chastises him. Didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself today in the sight of the slave girls of his subjects as one of the riffraff might expose himself? So she names it, right? And David says, because this is always a great way to justify what you're doing, it was a spiritual thing, right? It was a spiritual. I was doing this before my God. Now, again, there's some whole things about what David and his God do that I'm going to be exploring in my next book, and it's pretty interesting stuff, and highly sexually charged. I know, it sounds strange, but it is. And, well, look, just keep in mind the way that the deity rushes his spirit into Saul and into David. If you read that in the Hebrew, the very word that's used is the word that also means to penetrate. So, just think about it. So, here Michal is, and she chastises David, and his reaction, no, I was just dancing before God, and what's more, that's the God who said, I'm the right person to rule these Israelites, not your father. You know, you want to really hurt her? That's a good way to do it. And my women and anybody out there would countenance what I'm doing. And they did. Remember, nobody stopped him, because he has that kind of power. To have a man have the power to expose himself in front of an awful lot of people, that's power, people. And you might want to think about, in our own time, how men have demonstrated all sorts of power publicly to say and do things that were incredibly dismissive. I can only say, grab them by the, and you know what I'm talking about, right? So this hasn't gone away either. And what happens to her? What happens to her? When she challenges him, she is condemned to be both forgotten and ignored again. Remember that after that first episode, when she gets him out the window, when she saves his life, she's completely forgotten. For a whole ton of the story, nobody knows what's happened to Michal until he wants her again. Otherwise, we would never have known. It's only when David wants her again that we find out where she is, who she's married to, where she's living. So here, the conclusion is, her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children, right? David will not even grant her conjugal rights. She is going to die barren. In Israelite society, to die without issue is practically speaking, one of the worst things that can happen to you. Remember all the women of Hebrew Bible who are desperate for children? This is how you remember. This is not a world that has heaven in the way that we tend to think of heaven, or even modern Judaism might imagine the world to come. This is a world in the ancient world where when you die, you are gone. You go to Sheol with everybody else. That's not hell, by the way. Good or bad, everybody goes there, right? And it is your children who keep your memory alive. It's your children who put the food on your grave so that you'll have food in Sheol. She's going to die, and she will be forgotten. She is condemned to be, and the other term for this is cast off from your kin, cut off from your kin. That literally means you won't have children. That's what the Hebrew means. So that's what's going to, you can't sentence her to anything worse in that sense. So effectively, what's happened? She has been given the death knell. She has been given and taken, Michal. Abandoned, given, and taken again. Abandoned now with a death sentence. Courtiers, messengers, generals, kings, brothers, fathers, and husbands, they've all played a part in what happens to Michal. And David is the most effective of them all. The most effective at taking, as we will discover, one of the most effective at raping, and one of the most effective at governing and decreeing what happens to the women in his house. Time for your questions. Nice for a rabbi to have an awful lot of evil things to say about the king of Israel, but there you are.
I know my brain's going like this. All right, I'm just going to talk real loud. I'm just going to ask this because I'm sitting here really curious. How come all these women didn't die from venereal disease?
You know, the Hebrew Bible does not, unfortunately, have anything to say about venereal disease, though it certainly has a lot to say about scales. So I don't know the answer to, how women suffered physically, emotionally. You know, there's a famous scholar by the name of Lipka who wrote an entire book on what she called sexual transgression in the Hebrew Bible. And she made the claim that, we knew it was rape when, I'll talk to you about this next week, but we know it's rape when we know how the victims felt about it, effectively. And that actually made me so enraged that in my, frankly, next book, in the most delicate way I could, I said, wait, what? The Hebrew Bible and its male authors don't generally care what women feel. So they don't write about it. And are you going to tell me that if you see a scene in which hundreds of women who are young women, girls who are, belong to Jabesh Gilead, see their fathers, their mothers, their siblings all killed, and they're taken by the Benjaminites and effectively raped, are you going to tell me, because the author doesn't say, and they felt really bad about this, that I shouldn't call it rape? So I don't know the answer to that question. If I ever find out, I'll let you know. Yeah, Pam?
This is just also surprising because I just read this story like a little child, and you can see any of the Hebrew connotations and probably just the translation of the Hebrew word. So, why was, if this is so evident when you read the Hebrew, why was David so admired as the king of so how?
Yes, beautiful. Yes, you would have seen, or at least you would have seen more of this. The English does have a tendency, our translators, whether Jewish or Christian, have a strong tendency to clean up these texts in ways, and also, there's just, it's hard to translate dancing in a sexual way, right? That's hard to do. So the Hebrew does lend information that you will not get out of the English, no question about that. And I could go on and on about the examples because I do with my own students at UNCC of, here's the English, here's the Hebrew. Guess what? Has your opinion changed? Right? And yeah, it has. So why is David so honored and considered the best king? Well, it is my argument in the second book, in A Company of Men, that in a biblical hegemonic society, what is actually valued here? What is valued are men who are great warriors, who speak well, who actually are in control of very well-established male networks, who are admired by other men for their virility, for their power to sire children, for all of these things. Right? You might as well ask Pam why the president prior to this one was so admired. You might ask because the same kinds of things are valorized. A man who is strong, a man who is virile, a man who is militarily capable. David is admired because he does all the things that a king does best. And in that next book, that's why I should maybe come back next year and talk a little bit about this. One of the things that I say, this might be a little bit over the top for all of you, but the argument in A Company of Men in the last chapter, in which I look specifically at sexual violence of men against men in Hebrew Bible, right? My argument is that David is the better king because he's better at that too, right? He's better at inflicting metaphorical rape on his enemy over and over again. The taking of 200 foreskins? What is that? And in this world where a defeated enemy is effectively equivalent to a raped woman, and that's also, by the way, true of Greek society. You can see all sorts of lovely vases and Egyptian iconography where you'll see the enemy, pardon my being graphic about this, the male enemy literally bent over because he's about to be penetrated by the winner of the war, i.e. the Egyptian, or the Greek against the Persians. This kind of pictorial representation of sexualized domination of the enemy is all over the ancient world. And lest you start thinking, well, that's the ancient world, what a bunch of violent, crazy people they were, please go back and look at the pictures of Abu Ghraib. Because this stuff is still with us, right? The capturing of young girls and women and using them as wives and using their bodies, that's still with us. The sexual domination of male enemies in war, that is still with us. The ritualized mutilation of bodies as a way to humiliate is still with us. None of this has gone away. We have our own hegemonic masculinity to deal with. So, yes?
There was an Air Force scandal that I can't think of the name of, maybe 15 years ago. It was about a rape culture on, I think, an aircraft carrier.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I've read plenty of studies, particularly in In two realms. Fraternities are the obvious case, but in other cases in military realms. What kinds of rape cultures are going on? What's valorized? You know, how the men of these communities even actually urge each other on in really horrific, what for them is a game of attack and use of women, right? Those things are actually quite real. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, a couple things. Rape supposedly has been linked to power as well. I mean, that's
It's about power.
political
Yes.
as well. But could you tell us a little bit about David's relation with Jonathan? Because I have seen or heard or read that it may have been a homosexual relationship.
I have a whole chapter on it. You're going to be surprised. Do I think that Jonathan may have desired David in a way that was erotic and what we would call homosexual, though they certainly wouldn't have called that? Quite possible. However, my take on this is actually about what is the worst thing that happens to a man in biblical hegemonic masculinity, and this remains the worst thing that happens to a heterosexual man today, and that is if he is feminized, if he is made out to look like or seem feminine, you know, womanly in some way or another, right? And my take on this, which is complicated, but it's in here if you want to read it, and it is, by the way, possible if you don't want to buy the whole book to download just the individual chapters, is that what's actually going on here is a series of men who take on the role of subordinate, wifely role to a dominant male. And that David actually starts out, especially in the first episode of his arrival at court, as a kind of wifely character for Saul. Remember, soothes him with his lyre and takes care of him. And even his arrival there in that version is described like a bride going to a groom. There's language where Saul effectively, you know, uses almost ritualized language about how you take a woman from her father. And David is content to play that role for a while and then switches that role with Jonathan, who Jonathan then becomes the wife to David in a way and subservient to David. And then David becomes the Übermensch, the big guy, right? So that some of this is going on that has to do with how men adopt different roles in biblical hegemonic masculinity around power. So, but is it possible that we see from Jonathan that piece? Yes. David never says anything about loving Jonathan. David's a taker. You know, honestly, I have a bad Yiddish word for David. From a female perspective, he's a schmuck. Yes, sir.
Years ago, when I studied and taught sometimes the book of First and Second Samuel, I came to realize the real power behind the throne were Abner and Joab. And
Those
they
two.
were powerful.
Oh, you
powerful
bet.
men.
Oh, you bet. Yeah. They play incredibly important roles in facilitating and creating, right? We should all remember the way in which David desperately asks that Absalom be treated gently. And what does Joab do? Takes the opportunity to take him out, right? In a really humiliating, awful, and again, sexualized way, literally stabbing him again and again as he is helpless, hanging from a tree, caught by his hair, right? That Joab manages to do one execution after another for David, really, that David can wash his hands from. Oh, I didn't do it. It was this guy over there, right? Yes, Abner and Joab are unbelievably important. Joab makes the whole thing with Uriah possible that we'll look at next week. Yes, good that you caught that, because power isn't a matter of just one dude being able to do what he wants. power in biblical hegemonic masculinity is supported and contained and influenced by a network of men who are all participating in one way or another, and Joab and Abner are key to the stories.
I believe Joab kills Abner against the wishes of David.
Yes, absolutely. Right? And what is that about? He doesn't want competition for his position either. And the very interesting way in which one of David's dying behests to Solomon is get rid of Joab. Right? Because he's had too much. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a good catch. It's a good catch. Any other comments or questions? I always tell my students, be shy in your own time. That can include reactions of, good grief, Barbara, what on earth? You know.
Well, yeah, I feel good grief. What on earth? When did you start looking beneath the surface and recognizing the complexity of these stories and what went into that culture? And how does the Jewish community, how do they look at these stories now?
That's an excellent question. So when did I first start doing this? I would say, you all probably don't know that I've had multiple careers. And my first was 20th century Holocaust and 20th century German and American history. That was my PhD. When I came back to teach at UNC Charlotte, I did a second MA degree in religious studies, and by that time I was in rabbinical school, and I was in my 40s. That's when I first encountered these texts in a real way, in a serious way. And I started studying these texts, and first, I think I can say I was so indebted to the work of Phyllis Tribble, who some of you may have read, Texts of Terror, and Tivka Frymer-Kinski, who wrote a book that people still quote, Women in the Hebrew Bible. And both of them focused on the female experience. I immersed myself in a lot of feminist literature, right? I was very attracted to that work. So I was looking at primarily, you know what I wanted to do? I desperately wanted to find strong women in the Hebrew Bible, role models in the Hebrew Bible, right? That's what I was looking for. I was going to be a female rabbi. And what did I find? Yeah. So I think that was a first place, and then the more that I was looking at it, I also felt that the field of masculinity studies was becoming one of our cutting-edge fields in terms of understanding not just what happened to the women, but how is it that the male structures contributed to that. And I think my own contribution is to get us outside of the individual character of just David, but exactly to that system of men who are operative, to think in terms not just of the patriarch, but of the hegemonic system that we are dealing with. And I would say that that really started about 5 years ago, and that's when the writing explosion hit. So, you know, the next book is actually Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh's Sexual and Emotional Life in the books of Samuel, how the deity acts the man, because the deity is the role model, right? And I will confess to you one thing that genuinely worries me about my own work, and then I'll get to the Jewish community's reaction. I have lived in a world, as have all Jews, of supersessionism for over 2,000 years, of replacement theology, right? The Old Testament versus the New Testament. The Old Testament is the violent, bloody piece. The New Testament is all about love and kindness. Well, of course, if your teachers are doing the right thing, they've pointed out the amount of ugly that you can find in the New Testament. There's plenty there, too, because it's the same God. And the same God shows up on both sides saying things like, I'm casting out anybody who doesn't like me, into wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? So, you know, if we have the same God, we can find the same stuff. But I'm worried about my own work contributing to that. So actually, in the introduction to Rape in the House of David, I say, this is a concern of mine, right? That my critical approach to this is problematic in this way, that it could contribute. And I want to tell you, my community and yours, my community, yours. So there's something called the pshat. That's what I deal with. What is it on the face of it? What does the Hebrew tell me? And there's something called remez and drash and sod, which is the way Jewish communities, like Christian communities, have dealt with these materials, which is, can we find a transcendent message Can we somehow rewrite the story? Can we find, the glimmer of light and lift that up? And that's important work. That is important work, and I'm not going to gainsay it. Do I think that my community is a little bit more amenable to the critique? I do, because it's been Jewish scholars who've been doing that critique for a long time. Do I think that people in my realm will rush for this book or my next book? No, I do not. Scholars will, students will. But if you are coming from a faith perspective, this is really hard stuff. It's challenging. And here I'm going to tell you why I do it. And why this will be a compelling need for me for as long as I do scholarship and I write. If we don't name this material for what it is in its peshat, in its basic meaning, in our scriptures, how in God's name are we going to name what we're looking at everywhere around us? If we read these as nice little stories of the boy king, the brave shepherd, then how are we reading what has happened to this country and what continues to happen in this country and across the world, particularly where women are concerned? So for me, it is compelling because I am a rabbi to come to you and to come to my own community and say, look, we need to name this. And when we name it here, we can honestly say we can name Abu Ghraib in its context of thousands of years of hegemonic masculinity that is a sick system that we must do away with for the sake of our children and our grandchildren. There is not a child who is born into this world who shouldn't be born free, no matter who they are and no matter what their gender or sexual expression is. And that is the compelling need. I am thinking about my as yet unborn grandchildren. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any knowledge of Protestant ministers or non-Jewish ministers that are talking about this or teaching about it?
From the ministerial perspective, kind of, sort of. So I would say the one I know about right now is the one I actually am now a co-editor of the series I just completed, A Company of Men, for. So Johanna Stiebert and Emily Colgan and I are now co-editing the rape series, and I read a book last week from a Bavarian priest, so not in this country, Joachim, who has written a text on toxic masculinity in Christian texts and compares them to Egyptian texts and some Hebrew Bible texts. So clearly, Joachim is doing the work. Now, whether Joachim is typical of ministers here, I can also say I have a student who has just been accepted to Union Theological. His name is Matt Argonauta. Next week, he is going to be defending his thesis on Elijah and Elijah's masculinity, and Matt will be a minister of the word in a few years. And will he speak to this? I know he will. Do I have students that I think I'm going to try to send out into the world to do that work as ministers and clergy leaders? I hope so. But the majority of this work is done by academics, I have to admit, and what I wish is that more ministers would read it and think about it. So the next time we get together, maybe you want to ask your leaders to come into class. Yes, sir.
About 25 years ago, I think it was Ruben Green, Max Holland, who was the professor of Old Testament, did, I think, just a single lesson on the struggles in translating the King James Bible to clean it up. And the one example I remember is that Jericho always became feet. And there were a couple of others, well, there were several others, but if he said, if the King James Bible says anything about feet, they're talking about anything above that.
And in most cases that's true, though sometimes a cigar really is just a cigar. But next week we will actually encounter something like that, right? And yes, often feet are standing in. And when Jacob gets his thigh wrenched, the word there that actually, as Roland Bohr points out, is actually about male genitalia. Whoever he's fought with has squeezed him. Yeah.
My question behind that
Yeah.
is, are there any references of this kind, what you're talking about, in Talmudic literature, or do the rabbis talk about it in the 1400s, or any kind of...
Do they speak about these stories? Oh, gosh, absolutely.
In what context, or what sense do they speak?
Oh my goodness, that's another good question, because this next month I have to write a chapter on the rabbinic take on Eve. So it might be next week we'll have to do that. But how do the rabbis talk about Eve? How do the rabbis consider her story? What do they do there? I would say you get a very mixed bag, and is there hegemonic masculinity in the way that they are reading some of these stories? Yes, one of the most devastating and awful rabbinic moments is actually quoted in this book in the chapter on Tamar. And this is the Tamar who was raped by her brother Amnon. And I'm not going to deny that, I bitterly quote this, where the rabbis say and make the claim that the reason that Amnon was so angry with her, remember, after he rapes her, the word hate is used 6 times in the text. He hates her with a hating that is this kind of hating. And I actually also quote a text by the Holocaust survivor, my God, for some reason the name, it's an Italian fellow who's somehow escaping me, about the way that corpses or victims are humiliated and treated and not seen, right? And the rabbis say that the reason that Amnon's love, quote unquote, turned to hate is because during the rape, Tamar used a hair to castrate him. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? Right? You want to talk about blaming the victim? That is it is absolutely appalling. It's beyond appalling. It is so upsetting that, it makes me want to take the entire Talmud and just go, who are you people?
Is that rabbinic tradition?
It is a rabbinic voice. Of course, the rabbis also argue about it because, they argue about everything. But the fact that at any point you get that, and look, you get the same thing with Luther. What is his comment about Dinah? He basically says it's her fault. What happened to her from Shechem is her fault for walking out of the house. Girls should never walk out of the house. Women should never walk out of the house. We have traditions where what the clergy have done with experiences of sexual violence against women in our texts has been outrageously, frighteningly bad as the texts themselves, sometimes worse. And that goes for Christianity and that goes for Judaism alike, and it is desperately awful. Yes.
Hillsong Church recently, their struggles with this kind of culture that's going on right now. The big Australian mega church.
Right.
I don't know how many branches, but in New York,
Yeah.
branch collapsed several months ago, and now it's Los Angeles or something.
Right, exactly. John, you had a question?
Just repeat the question for the audience.
Oh, yes, that would be good. Well, that wasn't actually a question. Do you want to speak to everybody one more time so I'm not using your voice? Go ahead.
I was just going to say,
Hold on.
See, the problem solving begins. And next time, let's remember to have that hand.
My comment was that exactly what you're talking about is going on big time in the Hillsong mega church. That's an Australian church, but has, I don't know, a dozen or so big branches in the United States. And the New York church collapsed several months ago over exactly these issues.
Well, trust me when I say that I have students who are devout Christians who come in all the time and give me the story they've been told about these texts, and I will nod my head and my eyes will glaze over and I will worry, right? Because they understandably are shocked, just as I've clearly shocked some of you. Because that's what I do every year, right?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's remember that. Thank you. You know how much I come because of the pure joy of seeing you all again. And so nice to see you in person. Yay! I'll see you next week.
one for the library too. We'll get one for the church library. Yeah. Yeah, please.